When we open up the New Testament, we are not just reading a religious text. We're stepping into a world already filled and alive with philosophy. A world where Stoics spoke of the Logos, the Platonists searched for the true light, and Jewish thinkers described this divine wisdom present at creation and in the cosmos. The first Christians did not reject this intellectual world. They entered it. Greek philosophy shaped its language. The Roman roads carried its message. And the Hellenistic culture formed its audience. And so they took its deepest concepts and reframed them. And they reframed them around a person, Jesus of Nazareth. So tonight, on Chasing the Past, we're going to explore the Greek philosophical influences and the Roman world that allowed Christianity to grow, and how Christ came to be presented not only as a savior, but as the very reason and the very wisdom behind existence itself. What is good, you smart people? That's the first one. Cool. I'm going to stick with that one. Usually I do a couple of those, but that one seems about right. Welcome in, guys. This one is rooted deep in a personal journey, I guess you would say. But when I started going through these influences that we're going to go over, right? Everyone uses these words all the time. They're like, oh, I've read, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, or I'm more with like the Stoics, or I'm more, Platonistic. I really like the dialogues of Plato, right? I didn't know any of those. And now, in kind of going through them and studying them a little deeper, I started noticing something. And something that, I wasn't getting on Sunday, and something that really empowered the New Testament for me in my life. So I want to be like right up front too. When I do something that is explaining influences, right? Everything has influences, right? Like I was just watching The Island upstairs by Michael Bay. I can see two things. I go, that's a Michael Bay movie because of the camera angles and the wide shots and the, helicopter around the character scene, but also, and the explosions, of course. But the movie reminds me also of another one that became like that Apple TV Silo series. And both are good. I like both. The movie, The Island's good, and the Apple TV show was good. Not to waste too much time here on, TV, but I guess that's the key thing I'm going to get at here, is you can borrow something and you can have this idea and it can still be in the text, but it doesn't take away from any part of the meaning, the message, the importance of what it meant when it was being written, or for those people, or for us now who are using it, if that makes sense. Excuse me. And so we're going to go through these influences, and I think, if you're on the same path or you're looking for some of these are really good ways that you can kind of get into understanding the prior ideology of, the Logos in Sophia, in Platonic dualism, right? All the big one, the Jewish Hellenized world that then later gave into these wisdom traditions. And all of those, I'm going to review that and just see my mic like moving. I know I will, because I'm like, am I going crazy? Anyway, the whole point is that in studying these specific topics that then get used into the one that we are familiar with, in this case, the New Testament, it kind of brought more life to it for me, right? I'm now reading Stoicism, and the like Plato's dialogues. I picked up Friedrich Nietzsche the other day. Like, it's really opened my mind to these influences. And so I thought this was a really important one that we could conquer and journey through together. So I kind of gave you a little bit of a rundown, but the writing in this Roman-dominated world that then grew the people who wrote the authors of the New Testament, the entire movement of Christianity itself, what concepts, and that was a good question for me too. I was like, what concepts are they pulling from? Or because it's the Mediterranean, so what trade routes, what people, what contact did they have that then incorporated into maybe some of their writings? And so we'll just start with Stoicism. Well, I'll give you the rundown, shall we? So Stoicism, we're going to go through that. Platonism, we're going to go through Platonic thought. We're going to go through, of course, I told you about Hellenistic Judaism. So the Jewish and the Greek world merged together. A cool one for that is the Septuagint, which is a neat little thing. And, we're going to get into some philosophical arguments based on those for Christ. I guess Christos, this mythology that we get later. And then, of course, we're going to go into something I didn't really put into perspective until researching this, is the Roman context, right? The stability of the Roman Empire that allowed for the spread of these ideas and then eventually led to Christianity. All right. Step 1. We're going to go through Stoicism. So, Stoicism heavily influenced the thing that it's common in John's Gospel, which is this concept of the Logos, or the Word. And so in John's Gospel, where Christ is, it has I think it's the highest Christology, or the high Christology, where Christ is divine and is the ordering principle of the universe. This represents this Logos, or the Word itself. And the Stoic ideas usually involve natural law, virtue, essentially most of the ethical teachings you get in Christianity come from these ethical teachings of Stoicism. And so, and the language too. There's a lot of Stoic language in there. But the one that we're going to really focus on in this one and get to the end, I'll explain both, is the Logos and Sophia. So Logos being this word that became divine, and then also wisdom that became divine, and both of them became Christ in this case. So at the end, I have a lot of notes on there from pre-Christian and then Christian movement after that. And so the Logos and the cosmology it's kind of like this rational governing principle that in Stoicism heavily influenced a lot of Johannine, or a lot of it's really, honestly, every time I think about it, it's always John. This very high Christology. And of course, if you read John 1:1, you're like, wow, what a beautiful passage. It comes from this Logos mythos. And then from the Stoics, you get this moral philosophy that you get more in Paul, and you get more in Matthew. And, a couple of them, there's highlighted parallels, right, between, let's say, the Pauline epistles and the ethics of those with these Stoic ideas of, living according to nature and this divine reason and wisdom. And that's, a very Stoic stage. Well, I wouldn't even say that. It's Stoic in the way that it's focused on these inward movements and these virtues. So we'll just go through this framework of Stoicism essentially, and then we'll get into Platonism. But it allows for a lot of philosophical thinking between the literary, the analogies, the vocabulary, a lot of borrowing in the New Testament And, they did use common Stoic vocabulary. And the one that I was pulling up is Acts 17:28. That says, quotes, Stoic poets. It's the names. I need to practice these before. Aratus and Epimenides? I don't even know. I'm not going to try. Sorry, guys. Just got a weird headache out of nowhere. Anyway, this whole thing is, this belief that it's a ordered, rational universe overseen by God, right? And so that's the strong point for Stoicism that leads into Christianity. So they maintain that focus on, this Christology and faith rather than just personal self-mastery. So that's a good ethical and philosophical background for Stoicism that builds upon this language. And then that goes into, of course, we'll get into the Hellenistic environment. And from this Stoic background, this vocabulary, these ethics, you get into this Platonism. From Platonism, you get this Platonic thought, and it usually is the distinction between this material world and then the eternal, invisible world. And that really helped Christianity interpret, heaven, the afterlife, who is God, what is the nature of God, right? Platonism kind of gives it that dualism we were talking about, that gives it at least a realm to explain something that is invisible and cannot be explained, which I thought was really, really cool. And when I was going through this, the intro and then kind of the outro, how I was going to, end this, it was like they really did step into this world of philosophical ideas, right? They're everywhere, they're spreading, they're hearing them, if you're educated, right? It's a very small percentage, but if you're educated, you're reading these texts. And usually if you are that educated and you're reading these, you might also be the ones who are writing books that end up becoming something in the New Testament. And again, I will say that it is kind of indirect, right? You can make an inference, you can, kind of see that might be a Platonic influence of sorts. But from what I could at least find, it's indirect. But there is a world shaped for early Christian theology. And I don't know much about this yet. I'm still learning about the different sections of Platonism. But I was getting Middle Platonism. And with that, you get a blending of this Jewish Hellenism, right? So you get the Greek world and the Jewish world kind of merging together to make this atmosphere. And, again, we said the dualism of the soul and the body, right? The material and the invisible. You get, gosh dang. Excuse me. It gives you this metaphysical framework for the explanation of, the logos concept we talked about earlier, and the spiritual interpretation of the good, the ultimate good. And so this metaphysical dualism from Platonism is regarding the soul's immortality, and that's the soul's superiority to the body, right? So often this Platonic dualism gives you this rational basis for these theological claims that usually end up being about, heaven and the afterlife in early Christianity. And something that was new to me is the Platonic concept of the true noetic light, right? The intellectual, spiritual light that becomes part of this Christian theological framework. And I have a note here about the logos, but again, we're going to hit that at the end here. But it gives you this Platonic influence contributes to a new shift of thinking. And it goes to a non-earthly spiritual existence, a deeper spiritual existence. Because the world did have that, but it's more of this, it's more of heaven being this, I don't know, you're a renewed creation, rather than, let's just say, Hades, for example, right? You're not just like a shell of yourself, and it's boring, and it's kind of gray, right? It's not very fun. And now it's like, no, you get this new body, this spirit body, based on this, Platonic thought. And that gets built over time. So it really had an influence on these early Christian apologists who use these to describe the afterlife and the transcendence of the afterlife, as well as the transcendent nature of God. And again, we kind of talked about how it's indirect, right? It's not like there's a quote. It's not like there's a quote from Plato in there, right? Or something from this Hellenized culture. You're getting the atmosphere of what this world is producing and how they're using it to fit into this story. And so this, theological synthesis begins this, like a partner almost in early Christianity, where you get another influence of Hellenistic Judaism. And he's added to my list, right? I have a bunch of Clement of Alexandria upstairs, but I got another one, Philo of Alexandria. So his whole MO here, he blended the Jewish scripture with Greek philosophy, right? This Hellenized culture we're talking about. And that influenced the style of New Testament authors, especially in, like, let's say the, epistles. Not necessarily. I mean, it's I'm trying to do this from memory here. I'm pretty sure it's the Pauline epistles and then even like Hebrews. If I find it, I'll put the screenshot here. But this blend of Jewish tradition and Greek culture gives you these early Christian influences. And something that we'll be doing later is a dive into the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, right? Now that gets used for the New Testament authors and the gospel writers. So when you hear something, and this was a shock to me too, you hear something about, oh, Jesus was quoting this, or they were quoting that, or he was pulling from this. They're pulling it from the Septuagint, not from the Hebrew Bible. So it's not like the people who are writing these know Hebrew, they know Greek, and they're using the Septuagint as their resource to write in Greek, not Hebrew to then use that to write in Greek. And so it was an interesting little fact there. And of course we have, their wisdom literature and the vocabulary, right? We kind of discussed all three of those. And so this foundation being on the Septuagint, this Greek translation of the Old Testament, it began to be used as the early primary Bible that would begin to be incorporated into the New Testament from the Old to the New, right? But then it also impacted the New Testament vocabulary and their interpretations of their theology. And some of those is the wisdom and the logos. So this wisdom, I guess word, it's just Sophia, right? It provides this framework for understanding Jesus as this embodiment of that wisdom. This divine wisdom becomes a person. And again, we already talked about John's Gospel. There's Colossians, Hebrews we mentioned. And then the logos, of course, the word being deeply rooted and influenced by this Jewish and Middle Platonic thought. And like I said, Philo did use it to almost like bridge the gap. So he took these and goes, I'm seeing something, and then put them together, and that's where we get this logos. The Pauline literature too frequently uses and adopts this vocabulary. So this really popular Hellenistic philosophy, again, this then becomes, the theology for their virtues, vices, the ethics, behavior, right? All of these come from this language and these ethics. And I don't know a whole lot about the form, but there is a specific form that's the rhetoric used. And then those techniques then are used to interpret scripture allegorically. And then we talked a little about the diaspora, the Jews outside of Palestine, and they decided to take a very strict monotheistic view, and then they kind of engaged it with this Roman world to give it the background. And then that background built a lot of these early Christian communities. And again, all of those add into these philosophical arguments for Christ. And the two that we're going to go over is logos, right? This divine word or reason, and then Sophia, divine wisdom. So to understand both of these, we have to see where they're from. So the Johannine logos, this word that became reason, and the Pauline synoptics, the synoptics had this too, is this wisdom, Sophia being this wisdom. Those two Christologies then synthesize. They then blend all of this together. And when they do, they present Jesus as both, right? Then he becomes the pre-existent incarnate that embodies like a part of God's creative service. This ordering of, power that acts as this mediator between the cosmos and God and the creator. So number one is, we're going to go through, logos, the divine word and reason in John. We're going to do, John uses this, and it merges with something called the Hebrew, it looks dabar? That's not right. Anyway, it's the Hebrew word that is this active creative word with the Greek logos, the ordering, the rational principle of the cosmos. Takes both, puts them together. So then the logos becomes the eternal divine, co-eternal, that is with God, and then serves as an agent of creation for God. And the logos in the Revelation is that it became flesh, and that is Jesus of Nazareth. And so you bridge the invisible and the material into the material, Jesus. And there's a very unique Stoic, there's a Hellenistic idea of like meditating on this divine intelligence, and that becomes influenced by Philo of Alexandria. And so because of this logos and these blends, now you can make that claim in these books. And then Sophia becomes the other piece here, which is the divine wisdom, and that's the synoptics and Paul. And they kind of trace this to being there's Proverbs has the wisdom literature, and this wisdom becomes a personal, like a personified agent, right? And in Jewish tradition, Sophia is this treasured agent in creation. And because this is already kind of there, Jesus, he assumes this role. And then he becomes the teacher, the revealer. And so he becomes this wisdom of God incarnate, who then brings this divine counsel, the light, and the truth to humanity. In Pauline's theology, you have a hidden wisdom as well, or this mystery that was concealed before is now revealed and access to everyone from the cross. And you kind of know those things without the Greek words or the influences or any of those things. So I needed to dig deeper on this one, because I think these are two pieces, Sophia and Logos, that we need to kind of go into before go into the influences of the Greek world. Where did these come from? What did they mean? How did they build upon this? And then Christians build upon that. And in pre-Christian thought for Logos, right, this is the word or reason developed by the Stoics, right? It's the significance of divine, rational, ordering principle, right? Everything that animates the universe is the Logos. And so in, the Hellenistic Judaism, this world of Greek and Jewish thought, they adapted it. And by adapting it, it becomes the in-between agent, which I always thought was spirit, right? But it seems like the Logos seems, from doing this research, just real quick, it does seem like that is the intermediary rather than the spirit talking, but that's not what I've kind of grown up with, if that makes sense. We'll keep it simple. This serves its purpose as being pre-Christian, as the divine reason behind existence, right? The reason for cosmos being here, us being here, everything. It was Logos before it was a Christian word. And so then Sophia, right, in pre-Christian thought, again, we said Proverbs 8, and a lot of this Second Temple literature, you get this wisdom rooted in the Hebrew Bible. And it's this feminine pre-existent power that's present at creation, but acts as a personified, emanation, like a piece of God that is feminine, which also reminds me of the Spirit, as this, communicator between us and God, right? The thing that navigates the material and the invisible world, right? That is Sophia. That's wisdom. And so Sophia was seen as this emanation or agent of that wisdom, of God's wisdom. And again, I don't know where this is from, but it was really cool to hear. Often depicted as a spotless mirror for God's activity. Adding it to the list of to be looked up. So this feminine creative vessel in Sophia and this active, masculine, method behind creation, the Logos, these get blended together to create, this framework that allows early Christians to create, let's just say, the Gospel of John, right? And describe this pre-existent incarnate Christ. And that's where you get John 1:1, and you get this entire high Christology that comes from this blending that is technically Jewish and Greek, which anyone relating to this new movement would definitely be a part of, right? They would kind of have an understanding of, from what I could tell, Philo was a big deal. If you want to know the honest truth, he seemed kind of like a big deal. And so the synthesis then kind of emphasizes the borrowing that we got going on here. And kind of the key point of this episode is not taking away from anything. It's not, removing any truth from anything. It's giving another layer to this already deep, philosophical context that's going on. And they used it in a beautiful way to explain Jesus' role in, let's say, salvation later. But the distinction isn't there anymore. It now, instead of just two separate things that are kind of acting with pieces of God, if they're emanations of, the good, if it's Platonic, then now you just get both put together and it becomes flesh, and that person is Jesus. And so they intertwine both of those. And the last stop here, which I think is important, is because I recently took a history class for the degree that I'm trying to finish, and we really got into the Roman world a lot. And it was in a completely different lens than I've seen it, which, it was actually better to be in this Roman world under the empire than it was to be outside of it, at least in terms of stability, right? And when you get stability, you get the spreading of ideas. You get the potential to communicate the structure that you need to have stability for the spread, rather than a hindrance that we're always taught, like the Romans were terrible and they were so bad. Probably. But also the backbone of the message even going anywhere is because of this Roman Empire. And, I thought we're kind of running low on time. We're a little above the mark here. But maybe I'll do another one because I'm recently reading The Myth of Persecution by Candida Moss. And is it her name? I remember Candida. I'm pretty sure. I got it. Regardless. The important part of the Roman Empire is, let's just do these 6 bullets. Infrastructure and communication, right? There was the Pax Romana. So it's the Roman Empire's 53,000-mile-long paved road and a secure Mediterranean, right? So these shipping lanes, there's no pirates, there's no pillaging, right? It gives a new view to see how Paul traveled this Roman world and talked to the Gentiles, right? It was the security and stability. So the movement of this message was allowed to do so because the infrastructure was there. Then you have the common language, right? You have the Koine Greek, right? The lingua de franca, right? The language of the region. And so then you get this message that can go across the entire land based upon the structure of the empire. It's a connected, urbanized place where, these cities are more linked than we think. Because in my mind, it's like, oh, they're so far from one another, nothing could ever occur. It's pretty safe and stable. And so when you have those things laid down, then you get the message. And you get to the message of, you're important, right? It doesn't matter about your social status, your gender, your ethical background, right? It's this idea of a universal religion that everyone can have regarding any of those superficial things, because you're bridging the gap between the spirit and the material. And so this, message of salvation and hope and equality amongst everybody, that seems pretty attractive. And it seems pretty attractive to those who have none of those things, right? You have no status, you have no family to back yourself up. Maybe you're not even from here. Maybe you're a slave, right? You're someone that has no status. This really would speak to you. And not only would it speak to you, but you would see it in front of you, right? The ability to do these like social services almost and like build charity and take care of the poor, take care of those in need, right? The ethical message, right? It's like this humanitarian work for Christians that then became like, oh, I'm seeing these great people do these great things. I want to be like them and I want to join whatever they're doing, right? And that wins over a lot of people who are not Christian or have never heard this message. So if you've never heard it and then you look and you see these things happening, you're like, wow, what a great person. And that still happens today. I'm not saying that doesn't. But despite popular belief here, for a long time, it kind of was like, hey, do what you want, but just do not topple the state, right? Do not threaten the state. And that's kind of the thing where if you go researching the historical Jesus, you get why would he even be crucified for that? It's like if he was threatening the state, right? That's a whole nother episode. It's up here. I understand that's a good one. And so it didn't really care. So there was this Roman policy that allowed for at least long periods of kind of religious, like religiously tolerant framework that allowed for things to spread. So when Christianity was in its infancy, it was more like a subcult from that kind of got mistaken with like a version of Judaism, like a Jewish sect inside of Judaism. And so then you have, of course, the resilience through, the martyrs, right? Now, even at a small scale, and this is why I got this book from Candida, is because it might not be this extreme persecution you're thinking of. Doesn't mean that sometimes in small isolates it didn't happen. I'm saying that even those small little like activities bolstered the claims of the faith. So then believers They were like, oh, wow, look at, they're willing to do that and be kind and let me in. You see the gears turning, the wheels moving. And so even though this extreme persecution was kind of mainly focused in the like 3rd century and then like early in the 4th. But before this, it was kind of like this, localized, intermittent, like, problem. It was like it wasn't like all over the place. And so that did allow the Christians to operate with, considerable freedom in this case. And, one other episode will be, this martyr mythos. But I think this is enough here to go through the Greco-Roman world that, these people would have came up in, right? They were familiar with it. They had heard it. They had made, if they're studying, right? If they're, learning and they're educating themselves, they're learning about these things. And I don't think that's too far of a stretch to go, okay, it doesn't mean that they're anything wrong or that they're just like using it like, I'm going to get you, like, I'm going to trick you guys into doing good stuff. And then, right, doesn't make any sense. But it's more like, Christianity didn't spread because it like shut out the rest of the world. Like, oh, you guys are all false and it's so bad. Like, we don't even need that, which is what we do today. And I'm like, hey guys, I think this is a good video to understand why they didn't just silence the world around them. They like spoke the same language, right? Whether it's the framework they used, the exact language, morals, and ethics, right? Like if they used the methods of Stoics and the Platonists and they borrowed these wisdom traditions from the Jewish and Greek world that meshed together to make these things work, well then, don't forget, it was allowed to spread because of such a secure and stable environment. Well, they then took these things and made it their own, which is poetic and beautiful in itself. And so this early church claimed, radical things, right? Like, like the logos, that's not just this idea, right? Or like wisdom, Sophia, this isn't just a metaphor, right? Like truth is not just something you can't achieve, but you can embody, right? And so I think it's important that, 2,000 years plus later, if you want to count like going to the Greco-Roman world and then go back to the Greek and Jewish world, like those theological implications are still being felt today. Like we still feel those shockwaves. And I think it's important that we understand them in the beginning, in development, finalization, and then now into, the modern era. And I think that's a good way to end. I really do. I think that was kind of the point of doing this whole thing, because I guess I'll conclude with the negative, but like, I think we need to, let's say you're a Christian in the modern era. I think there's a weird disconnect that we have from these philosophical arguments that built the entire faith. I think if you understand those, then you understand your faith better. And if you don't, then you're missing out on the thing that these people did, the books that you're actually reading. And I didn't want that. So I decided, I'll just put a camera on my face and talk in a microphone and then tell you guys all about it, right? But this has been a work in progress. I'm still working through a lot of doing this for you and trying to give you something new rather than something boring. But I think this was a good one. And I thank you for being here. If you stayed this long, I appreciate you. Thank you. It's dinner time, so I'm going to have some chicken wings. Yeah, that's fine. Bye, guys.